my colleague, Professor Emeritus Joseph Weiler of the Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC. The ACLP is a working partnership of 3 organizations, each with a special interest in fighting corruption. I'd like to thank each of them for their support. First of all, TI Canada, of which I was formerly a director and of which Joe Weiler is currently a director, provided the initial impetus to form the ACLP in Vancouver. TI Canada is led by Susan Cote Freeman, Chair and President, and James Cohen, Executive Director. You'll be seeing more of them later on today. The Center for Business Law at the UBC Law School, which is led by Dr. Carol Liao. The center has provided technical support for most of our ACLP webinars. And lastly, the International Center for Criminal Law Reform, ICCLR, at UBC, led by Dr. Peter German, its president, who is serving on today's panel. Under the ACLP, we bring together experts in the field of anti-corruption to expand the depth and breadth of knowledge of each of our participants in this field as a form of collective action against corruption. We've been quite successful, we think. We began modestly over 5 years ago with a small discussion group here in Vancouver and local seminars also in Vancouver, to our present series of free webinars, which are routinely attended by over 100 registrants. Today, I think we've got about 120 people who have registered. Today's webinar is the 29th event that has been held to date under the ACLP, and it's the 9th webinar held this year. The webinar is led by our partner TI Canada, and it covers the important topic of Canada's foreign policy and the need to integrate anti-corruption into that policy. Before I turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Susan Cote Freeman, I would like to make special mention of a new initiative at ICCLR. This is the formation of the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute. This institute will be launched formally on Thursday, December 9th, which is International Anti-Corruption Day. And all of us at the ACLP wish this new initiative well. Now I'd like to turn it over to Susan Cote Freeman. Susan?
Thank you very much for the introduction, John. It's a pleasure to be here today for this important event, and I want to extend a warm welcome to all of our speakers and members of the audience. As John mentioned, our theme today is integrating anti-corruption in foreign policy. And we're holding this webinar very close to International Anti-Corruption Day, which takes place on Thursday, December 9th. But it's also happening just before the Summit for Democracy that's being held on December 9th and 10th. The summit, which is convened by President Biden, will involve 100 participating countries, including Canada. And it will address the themes of authoritarianism, human rights, and corruption. And there are also other summits this month where corruption will take center stage. The UNCAC Conference of States Parties, the Open Government Partnership 10th Anniversary Summit. So I say all this to illustrate that there is no lack of international initiatives and formal government commitments that recognize the corrosive effects of corruption and the need to combat this scourge. But I think it's fair to say that many of these initiatives and commitments have fallen short of the mark. We at TI strongly believe that the lack of effective action against corruption has been a major contributor to the rise of authoritarianism, state capture, and environmental degradation, to name a few, with the devastating consequences that we know for human rights, human livelihoods, and even human lives. So while it's broadly acknowledged, at least theoretically, that corruption is a cross-cutting issue, foreign policy and foreign assistance more specifically is often developed and executed in silos. We think this has to change, and we believe that Canada can and should strive to be an architect of this greater integration. I'm sure we're going to hear about this today, but the US has just released its strategy on countering corruption. And this notion of integration seems to be emphasized very heavily in the documentation. And let's hope that it's not just something that remains on paper. So efforts to curb corruption must be connected to our foreign policy efforts. And whether we're trying to reform government institutions, foster gender equality, promote vibrant civil society, or tackle climate change, anti-corruption should be baked into these efforts. But the devil, as we all know, is in the details. So we're pleased to dedicate this webinar to looking at how anti-corruption and Canada's foreign policy efforts can be more effectively joined up. We also hope that our discussion will provide some strong takeaway messages that those among our audience who are attending the Summit for Democracy can contribute to that event. So I hope this helps sort of situate the conversation we're going to have today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone to James Cohen, who's the Executive Director of TI Canada. Take it away, James.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you, John, for the introduction, and to our partners at the Anti-Corruption Law Program who have been supporting this initiative throughout the year and up to this very webinar. Hello, everybody. My name is James Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada, and I have to say I'm exceptionally excited to have this webinar today. It's a topic I've wanted to get to for a while, and we're having it at the lead off, as Susan said, to 2 weeks that are really focusing on anti-corruption in what's been known amongst anti-corruption advocates as the year of summits. We had the G7 and G20 have their own emphasis on anti-corruption. We had the UN General Assembly special session on corruption. The Financial Action Task Force had a particular review at their October plenary on beneficial ownership transparency. And of course, we have the Summit for Democracies, the Conference of State Parties for the UN Convention Against Corruption, and the 10th anniversary of the Open Government Partnership. Not only this, we've had the release of the Pandora Papers here in Canada. We had Sam Cooper's release of the book Willful Blindness. We had colleagues south of the border release 2 very prominent books on kleptocrats and their enablers as well. So within this global view and this momentum on anti-corruption and the release of the US strategy on countering corruption foreign policy, where does Canada stand? What are we doing on this issue? Are we prepared for the summits in this last stretch of the year? And what will come out of it? One of the reasons I'm particularly interested in this subject as the Executive Director of TI Canada, I have a background in international development and have worked on security sector reform for roughly 10 years before I joined TI Canada. And I have to say, I found within the international development community and security community that corruption was not well integrated into subjects. When I first started in the within the international development sphere, I do recall attending a workshop with a number of seasoned experts, well beyond my experience even now, and bringing up the issue of how about we address corruption in foreign aid. And one gentleman with many decades of experience told me, well, you can't just walk into a room and say, you're corrupt, and you're corrupt, and have any sense of achieving anything. And I thought, well, you can't also walk in with having a viewpoint of you're a human rights violator, you're a human rights violator, and you are too, and achieve anything. And that was the thinking about anti-corruption at the time. I've worked with different organizations throughout that time and talked to a number of experts. And I think that we're at a tipping point to finally truly integrate anti-corruption, not just as a corruption is bad perspective, but at a technical level with new tools and new understanding. So in that sense, I am excited for our panel today of experts who are going to be talking about anti-corruption from different perspectives, from conflict to environmental degradation to foreign aid, and to Canada's own place within the global illicit financial flow system. And I think we're going to have some interesting results from that conversation at the 30,000 foot level. Then what should Canada do, and what recommendations do they have for the delegation representing Canada for the Summit of Democracies? We're about to get started with that conversation. I will note that this conversation is being recorded. It will be available online later in the week. We do have the chat function open. If you have a specific question for the panelists, please put it into the Q&A. But we do encourage people to use the chat function. We've always had very smart people tuning into these webinars with their own brilliant ideas, so please add them in. I will say, please keep conversations civil, and please do not abuse the chat function to spam personal messages or spam ideas, I'll be forced to turn off the chat function if that happens. But do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, let others know where you're coming from, and so that you can engage, hopefully even offline after this webinar has happened. So starting things off, I will introduce each speaker very briefly because we have a lot to cover, and I'm going to be the mean timekeeper on them as well. To get this cross-cutting view of corruption, we're going to turn to my colleague, Natalie Hogg, who is the director of Transparency International's Defense and Security Program that's based in TIUK. Natalie has extensive experience in the foreign aid field, has worked for a number of organizations like Save the Children. I have worked at Transparency International, or Transparency's Defense and Security Program, and I'm eager to hear what updates she has on the program. Natalie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, James, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm also really looking forward to hearing the other panelists' contributions and the discussion. As James said, I lead the Transparency International Defence and Security Programme, and a big part of our work is looking at the links between corruption and conflict and the role of the defence sector within that. Corruption is now widely recognised as a threat to national and international security, and is also therefore clearly seen as a threat to democracy, human rights and the rule of law. And it's both an outcome and a driver of conflict. And we've seen this around the world in different contexts, even this year. In 2018, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, in remarks to the Security Council, painted a really vivid picture of the role of corruption in undermining institutions, depriving people of their rights, triggering conflict and impeding recovery, and went on to say that combating corruption and addressing governance challenges, which like the root of many conflicts, must be a component of preventative approaches to build a solid foundation of trust and accountability and increase a society's resilience to crisis. So the focus on the defence and security, why do we focus on the defence and security sector? It's perhaps the key sector on which national, regional and global security rests, and therefore is of concern to development, human security and human rights. And we focus specifically on resilience to corruption in the defence sector. One of our main outputs is the Government Defence Integrity Index, which covers 86 countries and measures the level of corruption risk in national defence establishments by assessing the existence, effectiveness and enforcement of institutional controls. And we've just published the third iteration of this index. I'll run through just briefly what the GDI covers in the scorings and some of the main findings before looking at Canada's assessment. So the Government Defence Integrity Index covers 5 key risk areas, which are these ones presented here. And they're looked at through a set of 77 questions and 212 indicators. So what it provides is a really comprehensive qualitative data set for each country. Each indicator is scored and the scores are aggregated, and it awards each country a range of a score from A to F, F being a critical risk of corruption and A being a very low risk of corruption. The key findings from the GDI, this iteration of it, are that 62% of countries have high to critical levels of corruption risks across the defence sector, which is really concerning given the role that we're looking to our defence sectors to play in our security. And furthermore, 86% of global arms exports are originating from countries with moderate to very high risk of corruption in the defence sector. And 49% of global arms imports are arriving in countries with a high to critical corruption risk in the defence sector. So what I'm showing here is Canada's overall score on the GDI, and you can see that it scored a C, which is a moderate risk of corruption, which might be of surprise to many, and I will speak a bit about why that's happened. Given the size of the GDI, there's an awful lot that we could say, and we know, you can see here there's weaknesses in whistleblowing policies and procedures, where Canada scored a D. But I want to focus specifically on the risk area of operations, where Canada is assessed as an F and so to critical risk. And it should be noted that this is really in line with the rest of the index, where the index average is also 16 out of 100 points and scoring an F. And it's in good company with countries assessed from NATO, the EU, the G20, the G7, and the OECD countries, where they're getting an average of a D. So this problem of corruption risk within military operations is a generalized one across the index. It's interesting for Canada, which has really got a good reputation for governance and building integrity work in defence sectors, but that it doesn't necessarily show that same level of focus on its own defence sector in relation to military operations. So there's a sense of it being a problem elsewhere rather than within the Canadian systems. And the risk of this is that operational corruption risks at the end of the day will undermine missions and perpetuate insecurity, and therefore undermine Canada's own foreign policy aims. This can happen through the diversion of resources to illicit markets, bribery in exchange for employment, or abuse of civilians. And it exposes missions to reputational harm, waste resources, and feeds into corruption in the operational area. Armed forces can obviously model integrity-based behaviour and support integrity and good governance initiatives, but they also come with a huge influx of resources and political support for host nation actors, which can be used to augment the influence of corruption networks that benefit from conflict and under peace. So I think in the conversation, hopefully we can discuss a bit more what some of the solutions are to this, but corruption interacts in multiple ways with conflict, both causing conflict and exacerbating conflict. How defence sectors are governed as one of the key sectors and how resilient they are to corruption is therefore really important if we want them to play a role in bringing about security. The GDI we see as a tool that can be used by countries both for looking at their own defence sectors, but also looking at the defence sectors of countries that they work with and countries that they trade with and countries that they seek support through security sector assistance or security sector reform and governance programmes. It gives you a comprehensive snapshot of the types of risks that the sector is facing. So I don't know where I'm up to my time, James, there, but I'm going to stop there and hand back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Natalie. You had a bit of time, but that leaves us time for the question and answer period and for the crosstalk between panelists. Maybe if you want to stop sharing.
Yeah.
Your panel. And next from there, looking at the conflict perspective of how corruption is a cross-cutting issue there and how important it is, let's turn our attention now to environmental degradation. We didn't see too much conversation around corruption and environment at the COP 26 in Scotland on climate change, but there are a number of organizations working on the cross-section of environment and corruption, and one of them, of course, is here with us today. Elizabeth Hart is the Senior Director at the World Wildlife Fund in the United States, where she leads the Targeting Natural Resources Corruption Project. Liz has an extensive resume in the anti-corruption space, having worked on governance issues at USAID and having headed one of the lead organizations on anti-corruption, U4. So I won't get into everything you've achieved, Liz, but I'm looking forward to your contribution here, not just from the environmental perspective, but from your wealth of knowledge over the years. So I'll turn over the floor to you.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to this discussion today. I'm really delighted to be here to share some insights from the Targeting Natural Resource Corruption project that I head up. And first, I should just say that the project I lead is a consortium of several organizations, and while we're based at the World Wildlife Fund in the US, I'm speaking here not so much as a representative of WWF per se, but rather from the learning of this project, and as James mentioned, my own experience as a researcher and practitioner focusing on corruption in the international development sphere for many years. So I think maybe the first thing to say is that our project at WWF and with our consortium is really kind of a incarnation of corruption as a cross-cutting issue. Not only in the sense that we're trying to introduce learning and practice that has been developed in other sectors to the conservation sector, and I should really note that this was the vision of USAID, who is the funder of this project, and they came out with with this project really from understanding that within the biodiversity and conservation sector, that a lot of the learning that had started to take place in other sectors about the impact of corruption and the way that it can be responded to really hadn't kind of made it into conservation work with the same intensity that it had in other areas. And as James has pointed out, I think that's starting to change. There's a lot of initiatives that have started since about the same time that TNRC started 3 years ago. And so it's excellent to see that development, but there's still a good ways for us to go. And so the other aspect, of course, is that not only are there tools and learning about corruption that apply across sectors, but within the kind of conservation world, there's just a huge range of impacts that corruption can be understood. We should be really trying to understand the impact of corruption in these different areas. So from development policy to climate, even linkages with organized crime and how that's affecting illegal trade in natural resources and things like that. So our work really focuses on the impact of corruption on conservation and natural resource management outcomes, including climate around the world. And just to explain kind of how we look at it, we really look at corruption not as a standalone environmental crime, law enforcement issue, nor as just a due diligence and contracting and protecting resources against abuse through corruption. But we really look at corruption as a facilitator of other environmental ills. So corruption and corrupt actions by individuals, as well as structures of governance that are permeated by corruption, facilitate and even drive a whole host of environmental ills that are adding up to the loss of biodiversity, the dispossession and exclusion of indigenous groups, deforestation and related climate impact, depletion of critical fisheries and global food supplies, and that's just to name a few. So maybe just to illustrate this a little bit more in the areas that we work in, our projects and others that we work with have really been able to document in a lot of different cases the way that corruption impacts outcomes in this sector. Within illegal wildlife trade, corruption and corrupt actions really punch holes in systems like CITES controls that are intended to protect endangered species. Some papers that are available on our website look at how documentation fraud and illegal trade and transport of animals and forest products and animal parts are all facilitated by actions of corruption. And one of the really important kind of aspects of a corruption lens that we see when we're looking at wildlife crime, for instance, is really that it helps us look beyond just the sort of the frontline offense. So, one of the things that's really been identified as a problem is that in many cases, the investigation kind of stops with the seizure of the rhino horn or the ivory or the arrest of poachers. But what we've heard from so many different actors involved in these cases is that these actions are almost always linked to higher level networks, to sometimes even politically connected people, and they're facilitated by corruption. So following the money as one anti-corruption method is just really important in this area. Excellent research has also documented how illegal products permeate even nominally legal supply chains. So we have, really sort of the clearly illegal trade in various protected species, but within, for instance, wood and seafood, from source all the way through transit and processing and transformation into other products, corruption is undermining traceability and transparency initiatives. There's a paper on our website about the US and the EU approaches and some of the weaknesses that when you put a corruption lens on those processes, you start to realize the gaps that quickly emerge. We also, it helps us understand some of the sourcing issues as well. So we have documents and papers and others. We're not the only ones working in this, but documenting politically connected people getting access for forestry concessions in nominally protected areas. One of our partners is actually working on a really interesting case, a kind of exploration of whether or not there's a way to scrape a number of different public and proprietary data sources to try to identify the connections between politically exposed persons and forestry concessions around the world. And that information can be used by financial institutions or others to help identify where we could be doing better due diligence within the financial sector. Other partners are looking at the ways that at the micro level, corruption can affect the dynamics of local fisheries. For instance, one country is working on creating a new way for fishers to register their boats so that they don't get shaken down for bribes. And we know that one of the things that happens is once a small entrepreneur enters into the illegal system in one way or another, whether it's through bribery or something else, then other illegal acts kind of can become much easier in that setting. So trying to take some of the corruption and the illegal acts out of some of these processes is really important. One of the things that we've just started to explore is the corruption behind infrastructure deals. And anybody who followed the car wash case in Brazil or any number of other cases knows how much corruption is involved in infrastructure around the world. But one of the things that's really been highlighted by our researchers is the impact that once a deviation from a plan has been bought and paid for and a new road starts to be built, that road doesn't just, isn't just a result of corruption in itself, but it then opens up and perhaps a whole new area, and illegal logging tends to follow on that and other things. So the environmental costs multiply from corruption that starts out just targeting one particular project, for instance. And one of the things that our researchers have found is that one of the highest impact points of corruption is actually at the planning stage. So while we have a lot of knowledge about how to do citizen monitoring of road building and making sure that we're using the right, that contracts are being fulfilled and that the right processes and supplies are being used to actually build a road, we're not doing so well at looking at the higher level corruption where the impact may be much greater in terms of making a decision to put a road somewhere in the first place and what kind of environmental impact that has. And then I guess the last thing I would just say is, again, kind of using this corruption lens, the other thing that it really helps us look at is that an environment of corruption and non-accountability creates a permissive environment for a lot of these ills and others as well. Violations of the rights of Indigenous people, human rights violations, it just gives us a perspective to be able to see the range of different ways that corruption is actually impacting work at all levels of conservation and natural resource management, and not forgetting the role of international actors as well, and those who kind of helps obscure ownership of fishing fleets, of logging companies, that kind of thing. I'm sure we'll get into a lot more of that, but I hope that kind of paints a picture for you of the ways that we see corruption really impacting conservation and natural resource objectives. And thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Liz, for painting a bleak picture of just how far into various environmental issues corruption can infiltrate. And we'll get to as I think you pointed out, the ripple effects from every singular corrupt act and how it affects biodiversity, it affects economic well-being for local communities and so forth. But on that point about enablers who are helping, the ghost ships and whatnot, we have to look at Canada's place within the global illicit financial system and that illicit financial system. So for that perspective, I'm very happy to turn over to Dr. Peter German, who many of you on the line might know. Dr. Peter German is president of the International Center for Criminal Law Reform. He's a lawyer member of the Ontario and British Columbia bars, and he was previously a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, serving as its Director General of Financial Crime and as Deputy Commissioner for Western and Northern Canada. I think, as John alluded to, he is now heading the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute. He's been very prominent in the news in the last couple of years, heading an investigation commissioned by the British Columbian government on the role of money laundering in BC casinos and other luxury areas that have led to the Cullen Commission. His insights have been highly regarded in helping Canada fight money laundering, or as we also call it here, snow washing. So, Dr. German, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, James. That's a very kind introduction. I didn't even write it, so I appreciate that very much. That's very kind of you. And I'll just one comment, and the dirty money reports, which are freely available online, it was not an investigation. I'd refer to it as a review. And one of the issues has been out here, the absence of or the failure of actual criminal investigations. But with that aside, I want to thank you and ACLP, John Ritchie, Joe Weiler, Susan Cote Freeman from TI, and for arranging this workshop. It's the timing could not be better, obviously, with what is taking place here shortly. Thank you also for mentioning the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute. It is an integral, or will be an integral part of ICLEAR, the International Center for Criminal Law Reform. If you're at all interested, and this is my only advertisement, take a look at www.iclear.vaci.org. And we have an outstanding board of advisors and so forth, and we're looking forward to the launch on December 9th. So I'm going to just take a sort of a broad-based approach here for a few minutes. The Summit for Democracy is really a U.S. initiative primarily, and kudos to the United States. We've seen the U.S. lead in other areas of anti-corruption. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act back in the 70s is one, and it's easy to ascribe motives to why governments do different things, but today we accept the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act as mainstream leading legislation in this area that's been followed, copied not necessarily, but has been a blueprint for countries around the world. And we often forget how it all came about, what were the scandals of the 1970s. That becomes irrelevant. Motive almost becomes irrelevant. It's a matter of doing good things. And recently the United States also brought in Magnitsky legislation, as we know, and that is now working its way around the world. So, kudos to America for this initiative. We also know that the Biden administration is very active on the anti-corruption kleptocracy front, as is Congress. A lot of initiatives coming forth. In fact, a mind-blowing number of initiatives. It's hard to keep track of them all. And this is particularly interesting because corruption really became a mainstream discussion point with the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2002, 2003 area. Before that, other than the OECD anti-bribery convention, we really didn't talk about corruption very much. It wasn't mainstream. It is mainstream now. And I think we're seeing a convergence of a number of things. If you take a look at the Summit for Democracy, it's talking about authoritarianism, human rights, and anti-corruption. And really, all three of those boil down to anti-corruption and corruption. Corruption is now seen as a huge human rights issue. It is an issue that you see goes hand in hand with authoritarian regimes. And of course, anti-corruption being that third pillar. So this is definitely a huge international issue and has been recognized as such. There was also a special session of the UN, as we know. And I would just point out that in some ways, well, it has been pointed out that there is a bit of a democracy deficit in democracies these days. There seems to be a bit of a move in a lot of democracies towards more authoritarianism, which is not good. But really, if you think about it, with the current public health crisis that we've got, we as people living in democracies are actually encouraging our governments to be a little bit more authoritarianism. We're turning over a lot of de facto power to public health officials and so forth, and with good reason. You know, let's get vaccinated, world, and get rid of this virus. But you know, it is this concept that people other than democratically elected can actually make decisions that impact on all of us. So we have to be very careful that it is done in a judicious fashion, and that we recognize that democracy is what it is all about ultimately. So I'd like to get to my topic and talk very briefly about the criminal aspect of all of this. There's a real symbiotic relationship between organized crime and corruption. Organized crime loves corrupt countries and corrupt societies. It thrives in those areas. But organized crime also uses corruption for its own nefarious behavior. So it is that relationship that makes for a marriage a marriage of convenience, let us say. And money laundering is an enabler for organized crime. So all of these come together. You can have a corrupt society. Organized crime will target that society, and money laundering, the movement of illicit funds through the world, which is estimated at well over $1 trillion, that flies through the air in digitally, zeros and ones, be it Dubai, London, New York, Hong Kong, and so forth, is really just that a symptom of it in many ways. Take, for example, yes, I worked on the casino issue here in British Columbia, but take a look at Southeast Asia by way of example. As China gets tough on casinos and gambling in Macau and on the mainland, it moves somewhere else. And we've seen a movement into Southeast Asia of huge casino operations. We've also seen precursors from China moving south into Southeast Asia. And where do those precursors end up? They end up in drug platforms in Myanmar, Cambodia, and countries that are ill-equipped to deal with issues that we just accept in a democracy. So organized crime moves with the production of drugs. The organized crime networks, these transnational organized crime networks, are huge. They will corrupt officials to further their illicit operations, and they rely on supply chains that go through neighboring countries and so forth. So it really, organized crime can be a huge destabilizing impact on countries that are ill-prepared, ill-equipped to deal with it. And so this is a real live issue. How do we deal with this? How can the world community deal with it? Well, one way of doing it is transparency. And of course, Transparency International, the title says it all. It is when we are transparent in government and it is clear what government is doing and why it's doing it, where there is access to information, where decision-making is in the public domain. You are bound to have a better product. People will live in a freer society and so forth. Closely aligned to that is beneficial ownership. And that's something that we found in British Columbia. It is hard to know who owns the land. It is also hard to know who owns companies. And we now have the Landowner Transparency Act in British Columbia, the first of its kind in the country, LOTA. It will be interesting to see how successful it is. We've seen examples of beneficial ownership registries in other countries, such as the United Kingdom. I think we're all in a learning process here in terms of public-private, garbage in, garbage out, all of those issues involving beneficial ownership registries. We know that the federal government is also looking in this direction with respect to corporations, which is clearly very important. The other point that I would like to make, and that is the discussion about corruption being a human rights issue is not something, it's mainstream now, but it wasn't 10, 15, 20 years ago. When I did my doctoral work, I argued that, and I did it on grand corruption and kleptocrats, and I argued that they acted much like war criminals, and the impact on vulnerable groups, women, children, and so forth, was akin to that of a war crime. I didn't quite formulate it in the way that it's formulated today, but that is seen as a human rights issue, and it is very much a human rights issue. I argued my thesis at one time at a conference in Canada, and it was sort of poo-pooed, a war crime. You know, these are two different things. But I can remember dear Dimitri Vlasis, the head of the corruption unit at the UNODC, saying, no, people are starting to talk about corruption as a human rights issue. Well, it's mainstream today. And what is really interesting today is that we have a movement internationally to form an international anti-corruption court. And there are people in a number of countries, including Canada, United States, that are arguing that there should be such a world court dealing with corruption. I see James's smiling countenance, so I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter. Just restarting the clock, as everyone heard. So we heard from the perspectives of conflict, of environmental degradation, and Peter got into the criminal elements and the cross-cutting issues of crime and global illicit financial flows. I'll turn it now over to Cheyanne Church, who I've had the pleasure to email back and forth with over the last couple of years since we first met in around 2016 when we were both based in the US. I was in DC and Cheyanne was in Boston. And I was very happy to have her on this panel and to help me think it through the development of it, as I find Cheyanne's thinking on anti-corruption is some of the most interesting thinking, and her unit that she's working with is developing some very interesting perspectives on how we get past just the corruption is cancer to let's look into the mechanics of how it works. So I'll hand things over to Cheyanne to look at the perspective of international development, as well as the perspective of how are we doing in terms of countries and actors working on these issues getting it. So Cheyanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Super. James, I believe I've shared my screen. How have I done?
Yes, you have. Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, thanks, James and Susan and TI Canada for hosting this important discussion today. As James said, he and I, as Canadians, have frequently lamented what should Canada do in the international sphere vis-a-vis corruption. It's a little bit difficult to follow so many excellent contributions, but I'll do my best to try and add some new elements, and happy to follow up with any aspects of it. So as James said, I'm Cheyanne Scharbatke-Church. I'm the co-director of the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy program, and we are a research to practice initiative that works directly with implementing actors to improve the effectiveness of anti-corruption programming in contexts of endemic corruption. Now, I know this webinar is attended by a variety of folks from different backgrounds, be it foreign policy, domestic anti-corruption world. So it's just worthy of a quick note that endemic corruption is where corruption is the system. A corrupt act is no longer considered an aberration. So instead, corruption is a regular, habitualized, and integrated set of practices at all levels and spheres of society. So think DR Congo, think Haiti, think Ukraine. These are contexts of endemic corruption. The Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy program's institutional home is the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is a global affairs graduate school at Tufts University in Boston, but I am happily based in very snowy Calgary. James set up this panel to discuss why Canada should integrate anti-corruption into our foreign policy. And my angle on it is going to be more specific to foreign assistance, because that's really more CJL's wheelhouse. So in an attempt to answer the question James posed, I think about Canada's feminist foreign policy and its commitment to gender equality, its commitment to reducing poverty, and the Prime Minister's 2019 mandate letters committing our International Development Minister to assess the effectiveness of our work. And none of that can be achieved without a thoughtful engagement with the drivers and enablers of corruption. Because corruption creates an anticipatable set of problems that undermine success and exacerbate conflict. I first want to talk about gender. So gender equality in context of endemic corruption can simply not be achieved. And why? Well, I'm just going to cover 2 quick points on it, but there's so much more that could and should be said. So first, corruption has a disproportionate negative effect on women, as they are far more likely to interact with the government-provided basic services like healthcare or education or even policing. And though these services should be free, they are typically fee for service, so payments are demanded. So let's think of the consequence of that using a micro example. A woman we met in northern Uganda told us the story of how her family was in a legal dispute over land ownership, which is a fallout from the many years of conflict in northern Uganda. The neighbor paid a police officer to falsely arrest her eldest son on trumped up charges. To get the son out of deplorable conditions in jail, she needed to pay a bail. Now that was a corrupt act in and of itself, because actually for this type of charge, it would be what's called a non-cash bail. So right there was a trumped up charge and then a trumped up bail. In order to access the funds, she had to sell her family's 2 goats, which are her only assets. Now, while she was able to secure the release of her son, it meant her family descended further into poverty, and they couldn't continue to fight to keep their land because they'd lost their 2 assets. Now, this is just a micro example of how corruption within basic state functions hurt women. So if we want gender equality and to bring women out of poverty, we have to be looking at how corruption in basic state services further punish women. My second point is that corruption is generally perpetrated through patronage networks, which in context of endemic corruption are typically male dominated. And this creates a discriminatory barrier for women to progress in their career. In our work in the DR Congo with female judicial officials several years ago, they regularly spoke about being overlooked for promotions and good cases because they were not seen as appropriately loyal or trustworthy. And because they were reticent to take on the expected corrupt behaviors. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second this whole debate that women are inherently less corrupt. That's not what I'm saying. But in this context, these senior women officials knew that they would suffer far greater consequences if caught for being corrupt than men. And so they were far more careful in their choices about when they should or shouldn't engage in corruption. And this blocked them from being seen as part of the patronage network, which in turn blocked their careers. So the second thing James asked us to speak about was how Canada should go about integrating anti-corruption. And I think the first step here is about broadening our aperture. So what do I mean by that? And I mean broadening the aperture to understand what it means to integrate anti-corruption into international development. Just this past summer, my team spent a lot of time on the phone with various foreign offices across Europe and North America, trying to understand how anti-corruption was thought about within foreign assistance programming. And by and large, it sits in this top left box. Stop the fraud, theft, kickbacks, leakage within the allocation of our foreign assistance. And that's important, but it needs to be understood as so much more than that. We also need to understand how people can manipulate programming decisions within aid. And that can be things like what communities to include, who makes it on a participant list, who to even partner with as an implementing actor can all be distorted by corruption. And we can be taking this into account with some pretty simple steps like stakeholder analysis. But we also need to be looking externally into our environment. So any program, be it an education program or a COVID-19 health response, in a context of endemic corruption should be asking, How might corruption block our ability to achieve results? Said another way, if we don't tackle corruption, is it feasible for us to achieve the results that we seek? And then when we find it, we have to think through about how we might address it. And this is very much what Liz was talking about in terms of what I heard in some of her programming. And finally, we have to broaden our aperture into the systems that we're trying to influence. So scaling up to the notion of poverty or stabilization. When desk officers within a Global Affairs Canada, for instance, are developing their overarching strategies, they must take into account the role corruption plays within the system. So for instance, if you happen to be the Ukraine desk officer at Global Affairs Canada right now, and you're thinking a lot about the NATO relationship in the Ukraine, you must consider the role that corruption plays in order to select the right strategy. Now, I've covered a lot there, and I know that James is keen for us to move on to conversation. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you for your time, and I look forward to a further conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Cheyanne. There was a lot of food. Can I ask the panelists to all turn on their cameras so we can have some crosstalk? What we'll turn to now is we heard various ideas, and the problem with all of that is that it's easy to stay in silos. We can talk about corruption for environment or for conflict or for money laundering or aid, but part of the goal of this conversation is to look at how are these things cross-cutting and how do they impact each other. So I want to have some crosstalk between our panelists, and I'd also invite our attendees. I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A yet. Feel free to add your questions in. We don't have to wait until the very end to do Q&A. If you have any thoughts, please do put them up. I've seen some people have some chatter in the chat box with some ideas. Thank you, Susan, for noting NATO's Building Integrity program. I've worked with NATO on that back when I was at Defense and Security. Susan, I think we may have even crossed paths once or twice. But to get into this crosstalk, let's look at a couple of examples of things and look at, I want to go to Liz, your example of talking about, you know, the perspective of, say, a fishing village and fishers having to pay bribes and the connections. Let's put that fisher in, say, the Bay of Guinea, where we're also exposed to issues of government corruption and even terrorism and human trafficking and cocaine trafficking moving its way. And maybe I'm leading a little bit, but can you talk about that ripple impact from an environmental issue through to different issues once these acts of corruption happen?
Thanks, James. And I think, I mean, you've already described that situation, so I don't need to say too much more about. There is a fair amount of evidence of convergence between environmental crimes and other kinds of illegal activities. So yeah, you know, I think where we start when we're sitting in the conservation world is really kind of starting to identify that problem a little bit more, because I think what we've discovered, certainly my coming into the conservation world from the anti-corruption world, has been an understanding that people in conservation know so much about what's going on, and they really understand that these issues are out there and having a very negative impact on what they're trying to achieve. But the language, the understanding, the ability to kind of unpack what corruption is happening and sort of take different pieces of it and kind of trace that to, okay, what can we do about it? That's the part that's really been missing. So, you know, that's I think what we're really trying to do. And it's the same experience that I had when I was with USAID working on these kinds of issues, is that it takes some time just to kind of build up a familiarity with how we kind of, you know, for those of us like you and Cheyanne and the others on this call, we've been talking about corruption for a long time. And a lot of other people have not found it so easy. And it's been really important just to kind of normalize that discussion a little bit more, and then give people the ability to say, you know, not all corruption is exactly the same. There is high-level corruption, there's low-level corruption, there's people who are getting involved in petty bribery because they don't have a choice. And there are people who are driving entire systems of illegality because and participating in corruption because that's the way they facilitate, as Peter was saying, their other crimes. So, I don't think that there's kind of an easy answer for, what would we do in that situation for that fisher in that village. But one of the things I think that is coming out of the conservation world is that sort of stop and look at the environment more broadly. So it's not so different from what we would encourage anyone. Certainly Cheyanne and I both kind of work more in the development sector, and we would encourage everyone to start with that kind of look, using a corruption lens, as I say, on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve alternative livelihoods for fishers in a village, what are the dynamics that are going on around that you need to take into account? And working with people to kind of develop that understanding and connect them with the right people who can help them, work through those issues a little bit more. I hope that answers your question a little bit, and I'll leave time for others to respond as well.
Well, let's jump into another topic. And Natalie, I'll put it over to you. Is with defense and security officials who you talk to, would they factor in that the ripple effect from these environmental degradation issues that Liz is talking about? What's been your experience in having that conversation about the interconnectivity?
Oh, that's quite a question, James. I mean, the discussions with defense officials, quite often we're not talking about corruption at all, because it can completely shut down conversations in different countries, especially when you're talking about the defense sector. So the types of advocacy arguments that we would be putting forward with governments are around defense and security sector ability to fulfill its own mission and mandate, the ability of governments to govern, as far as that would intersect with natural resource extraction, you could make that same argument. But I think it's very much in the defense sector about trying to build arguments why it's in the defense sector's own interest to reduce corruption risks, which is the way that we would always talk about it, rather than stop corruption. Feeding back into the piece that you were just talking about before, and trying to then break down that problem into something that's sort of manageable. One of the ways that we do that is to try to typologize the types of corruption risks that you see within a sector. And this is exactly what the Government Defence Integrity Index does, is break it down into a series of standards that defence sectors or governments or people within the ministries of defence can concretely action to reduce the corruption risk. And I think the comment from Susan in the chat is sort of alluding to that as well, that there are ways of analysing corruption risks and trying to work out what to do about them to reduce them, but to build the political will to take that on, because it isn't always easy. I think it's really about framing the problem of corruption in relation to what a government wants to achieve for itself.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Natalie. And staying on this topic of the interconnectivity and going from one subject of environment, Peter, I'll turn it over to you. And if we even look at the issue of environmental degradation, do you have experience or something to speak to about the illicit trades and criminal networks and environmental degradation, how it fits in and weaves in?
Yeah, thanks very much, James. I did have an opportunity to work with the UN briefly on the wildlife issues in Africa, but I think the point that I would make is that when it comes to organized crime, it is not commodity specific. So what you do see is this confluence of various different commodities. Organized crime is all about the money. So they're going to make the money in any way they can. Drugs is the obvious one, but if you tighten up, for example, you legalize marijuana, well, okay, organized crime has to find a better way to supply it, a more potent form of marijuana, or starts working in the supply chains and that sort of thing. So it's going to adapt to systems, but it is very much not commodity specific. So you do see, for example, I use Southeast Asia as an example. You see the same transnational organized crime groups involved in the drug production, drug trafficking, the trafficking in timber, and the trafficking in illegal wildlife. You can even add vehicles to that if you're looking at the Canadian context into Southeast Asia. So, that is just the reality of organized crime. It's about the money, and it's flexible. So let us not move too far away from our own country. We have lots to explain in Canada, and with respect to organized crime, I'll just use the example of money laundering in British Columbia. We know it's documented that the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico was using Vancouver to launder money. We've seen cases recently coming out of Ontario dealing with money that the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico was laundering into Canada. So what does that say? This is blood money. I mean, we know how the cartels operate. Currently, the cartels in Mexico are the ones of greatest concern, I suppose, to us in North America. But this is brutal business, and here we are laundering money. So Canada has to get its act together. I know that there are a lot of initiatives underway. We also just have to look at our own streets. Look at the downtown east side of Vancouver. It's, from my mind, getting worse before it's getting better when you look at the people living on the streets and the sad state of affairs down there. So great to look outward, but we also have to look inward. We've got to look for solutions, and all of this ties into corruption.
Great point, Peter, about looking inward to look outward, and the fact that our addressing anti-corruption in development and foreign policy isn't just a matter of, isn't just foreign policy, it's the connection to the domestic. So this ties a little bit into the question of that we got from Neil Levin and legal corruption from banks, secrecy laws. And I'm going to expand that question a bit to what we don't have is somebody talking about corporate corruption and transparency. You did talk. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, James, maybe I could just add one thing along that same line. We should also keep in mind when we're talking about what happens overseas is that Canada has also been a haven for the money of kleptocrats. And that's documented, whether it's money coming in from Haiti or from Africa and so forth. And again, that is money that comes from dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, and so forth. And again, Canada has to be very serious. And we're going to see with the Summit for Democracy that the United States will come out with additional sanctions at the on various individuals and entities that will at the same time as the summit gets underway. That's at least that's the speculation. And it would be really nice to see Canada doing something similar because what impacts the United States tends to impact us as well. And we can't be that reservoir for dirty money. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem, Peter. That was a great intervention. And I'll turn it to Cheyanne now. From the international development perspective, the idea of foreign aid is, of course, the goal is 0.7% or higher. But if we look at the impact of, say, a company abroad committing corruption in mining or P3 projects, or even, as Peter's pointed out, that very same money coming back into Canada through our illicit financial system. What was your perspective of how we need to think about foreign aid, not just in terms of giving money, but making sure we don't add to underdevelopment in many countries?
There's a lot of ways to respond to that one, James. So I think I'll just underline something people have said before. I think it is overly simplistic thinking to think about corruption in other places without thinking of it as a global ecosystem. It is a global ecosystem, and if folks didn't have places to spend this dirty money, it would become a lot less useful for them. So the large mansion outside of, what was it, Quebec City or Montreal that a Haitian minister bought for themselves, what's happening in Vancouver, if they didn't have places, or if they didn't have companies from which that would enable the use of those funds, it would become much more difficult. So I think number one, we have to think about it. While we're talking about foreign assistance, we have to recognize that nobody's totally clean, and we have to think about this as an ecosystem. In terms of the work that global affairs does overseas, I think we also have to think of it as an ecosystem. I've had many a conversation with ambassadors who, when we ask them quietly, privately, why aren't you raising the issue of corruption within this capital city? They say we can't, because if we do, whatever country you are in, be it DR Congo, be it Central African Republic, they will start pulling permits. Rubber plantation concessions, mining concessions, they'll start blocking their staff from being able to come into the country. And then the ambassador starts getting a call from their capital saying, hey, what are you doing? You're making our business interests complicated. And so when we think about the ecosystem globally, we also have to think about the ecosystem across the different sectors and how that can muddy the waters of what we might want to achieve through foreign policy, because the may not be in what some private sector thinks is in their interests, if that makes sense.
Great. Yeah, that makes total sense, looking at it from multiple angles. And Elizabeth, maybe I'll move to you on this. You mentioned supply chains and the fact that a lot of illegal fishing or other economies will work their ways into legal supply chains. In Canada, I don't know if you heard, we just had an implementation of the Modern Anti-Slavery Act where personal protective wear from Malaysia was stopped by Canadian Border Services because of accusations that it was made by North Korean slave labor, essentially. So from a private sector perspective, where looking at supply chains, where are these kind of indicators of corruption and stop and go points that they need to think about within the sector you're looking at?
Well, I wish I were as familiar with the details of the supply chains as some of our researchers are. So I oversee too many different pieces of this project to be able to be quite as complete as them would be. But I think, we're looking right now at the fact that both the US and the EU, for instance, have source monitoring processes for fish and for lumber. There's a paper that was recently done on the fisheries transparency efforts and traceability efforts. And I think one of the things that's really coming up there is how easy it is to fake the documentation at various points along the way. And certainly that's also true with CITES. It's been documented from some of our colleagues. So, one of the things they're recommending is obviously moving from a paper-based system to a more online system so that there's the ability for better kind of real-time tracking. There's a lot of small-scale initiatives that are starting on using various kinds of technology. We know that that's not always going to work everywhere, and that there's lots of ways to punch holes in those systems too. But I think probably the best thing I could say is to refer to some of the analysis that's been done by others, and I can share some links to different pieces on that. But the points that have been made already about really needing to look across the different sectors and the different priorities that we're pursuing. And, I could say from an environmental or a climate perspective that the growth opportunities of different business interests may not be the things that are going to align with actually getting our climate objectives met. And, and we're not, that is an incredibly difficult conversation to have. And the trade-offs are enormous. But once we see the connections between these things, then at least we can start to have those conversations more effectively. But on supply chains, I'll share a couple of resources in the chat.
Great. And Natalie, turning to yourself, talking about trade, you had in your presentation the trade flows of arms from supplier countries to importing countries. There is the International Arms Trade Treaty. Even looking from that business perspective of a very critical and sometimes secretive area, where the corruption risks in that, and where does your branch of TI recommend how to bring transparency to this supply chain and very critical area of trade?
Thank you, James. Yes, so clearly the defence sector is one of the least transparent sectors in the world, and it's quite often it's the rationale for it is national security. what we're finding in the through looking at the Government Defence Index results is that actually there's not a particularly strong relationship between the strength of integrity within a defence sector and secrecy. So maintaining secrecy within the sector is actually more of a political decision than a requirement for a strong defence sector. So there's huge transparency gaps across the whole sector, including within the arms trade, which ultimately leaves an arms trade that can be undermining a foreign policy. And we see that all around the world with arms being exported to countries that have got a high risk of corruption. And certainly when we look at companies, the vast majority of them are really lacking transparency all the way through the supply chain. So I think, within the Arms Trade Treaty, what we want to see is corruption risks being used as an assessment for the awarding of contracts, and it being seen as a clear criteria for the arms trade. And within companies, there's a huge amount of work to do in relation to due diligence all the way through the supply chain, linking to the broader movement of beneficial ownership, for example.
Great, thank you very much, Natalie. I'll take one more question from the audience here before we move into recommendations to Canada. This is from Dr. Andy Thomas, and this is an interesting one because we've talked about the technicalities around corruption. We've talked about dialogue, but there's something that often comes back in the conversation about corruption, and that's values and morals. And I will toss this to the panel for anyone's perspective on who is addressing the moral and value dimensions underlying corruption, and even your perspective of what does that mean and what does it do to address it. Does anyone want to take a crack at that? I see Cheyanne smirking, but Peter turned his mic off or mic on first.
I will just make a very short statement that Canada has a moral responsibility to deal with corruption, whether we think we are corrupt or not. It is a developing world issue. Canada is a member of the G7. It signed on to the OECD anti-bribery convention early on. It signed on to UNCAC. We have a moral responsibility to follow through. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Cheyanne?
So I think the question was, who is addressing the morals and values underpinning corruption? And in context of endemic corruption, that's actually a very interesting question, because it suggests that there is an immoral act going on amongst the people, like the woman who bribed to get her son out of jail. And I would challenge that to say, is it actually an immoral act, or is there a value problem there? It assumes that if we would act more on morality and values basis, possibly we could diminish corruption. And our research around social norms and the social norms that drive corrupt behaviors is that even if individuals do think it is immoral or against their values, the social norm pressure is so powerful that they will act contrary to their individual sense around corrupt practices. So I just want to say two things. One, in context of endemic corruption, I'm not sure a morality or a values-based approach is the right lens to be using, because in those places, similar to what Liz was saying, people often engage in corruption with a very different set of calculations. And when it's habituated and regularized, and helping your family member is the value-based way of doing things, it's not an immoral act in those contexts. And as conflict and fragility increases, I think that lens has to change even more because of the direct survival threats that people are experiencing. So who is addressing it? In the places I work, I wish it was addressed less, because I'm not sure it's the effective tool to catalyze change in context of endemic corruption.
If I could
Liz? Oh, Peter?
Sorry, go ahead, Liz.
Liz?
Sure. I think I would just reinforce what Cheyanne is saying. I mean, there's a role for examining what values people are pursuing, but I think that's really the place to start, is what really are the values that people are expressing. And when we assume that there's kind of just an immorality to any act of corruption, we're probably missing something. And certainly, you know, we've run into in the development field, you know, the sense that for instance, wealthy Westerners driving new cars because that's the requirement of the aid agency, that you have to drive a new car from the country where your money is coming from, that looks like corruption. And so when we start to use these kind of moral arguments, we really have to open up and check, you know, whose morals are we talking about here and what values are they? And they may not be the same. So just to reinforce that, but also to say what, you know, to point out what Peter is saying and to highlight that again. I mean, we have a bad habit of sort of looking elsewhere and saying it's all about them. And what's been said about beneficial ownership transparency, about the financial system itself, and that's the contribution of facilitators in the legal and accounting professions as well. All of that has to be taken into account. But so there's a lot of different moral issues involved, I think.
Peter, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, Liz has nicely captured it. Clearly, corruption is a top-down crime, as we say. So if the people at the top are corrupt, the people at the bottom almost have to be corrupt. And that's what you see in these societies that start going over into that tipping point where they become rogue societies. The rule of law no longer exists. So we can't blame, as Cheyanne rightly points out, the people at the bottom, the taxi driver, the police officer, and so forth. They are living in a corrupt system. So yes, I certainly get that, but I like also how Elizabeth has framed it, that, you know, we're talking about morality from different perspectives, and clearly I would still say there's a strong moral obligation on those of us in the developed world to deal with this.
Natalie, did you have anything to add to this one, or are you good? Okay, great. We're coming to the end, so I don't want to leave this with all addressing problems and not giving, especially anybody who's tuning in from Global Affairs Canada or Defense or Public Safety, no recommendations on what to do, or even the private sector on what to do. So I'd like to turn it over to the panel to talk about what are your top two, or if you've got time to cram them in, 3 or 4 recommendations on Canadian foreign policy on how we should actually be integrating anti-corruption into our foreign policy. So we'll go back to the start. Natalie, if you want to take a crack at it.
Thanks, James. So yeah, in terms of the Canadian defence sector itself, I think a lot of the views that people have expressed here about corruption being as a problem that happens elsewhere are probably reflected to some extent in the GDI results. And my first recommendation would be for the Canadian government to review those results and take a view on where steps can be taken to strengthen corruption risks. And there's some very clear standards set in the GDI around military doctrine addressing corruption, which means it starts at the top, filtering down through systematic corruption training to commanders, proper monitoring and evaluation of corruption risks and their follow-up at country level, and then the specific issues around the use of private military and security companies, which I believe has been also a live debate at times within Canada. So my recommendation to the Canadian government would be to engage with those tools that are out there. And I think Susan also mentioned NATO's Building Integrity Programme. TIDS is not the only action term. There's other people out there with great tools. There's a NATO BI self-assessment tool as well. That would be my first recommendation. In terms of then engaging with other countries, be it on security sector reform processes or security sector assistance, I think it is about starting to bring these different sectors together and mainstreaming corruption risk assessment into areas that traditionally have potentially shied away from corruption as an issue and focused more on technical training and provision of equipment to security sectors elsewhere. There's a there's a coming together, I believe, of the people working on security sector reform, anti-corruption, and people in the field of peace who are looking at how can we bring these fields together that have got the same aims but are working in quite different ways. So again, I mean, I think the GDI can be a tool for that. It gives a really good assessment of the corruption risks of any government that the Canadian government is working with, or any country that Canadian companies are selling to. And I think there's a clear snapshot of what the risks are in terms of the defence sector and corruption for whichever country the Canadian government wants to engage with. And I would encourage them to use that research and analysis that is out there to inform that.
Great. Thank you very much, Natalie. Turning it over to Liz, coming from a US perspective, I know you're aware to engage in Canadian foreign policy, but even if you can tell us what lessons Canada might want to learn from the US and others.
Thanks for that clarification. Yes, far be it from me to comment on Canadian foreign policy, but I can certainly comment
go
on
ahead.
some of the experience that we've had, both working within WWF and also my former life in USAID. And I think, top for me is really having this broad understanding of what corruption is and its impact, and that it is a crime issue, but it's not only a crime issue. And therefore it's, within the development world, it really needs to be seen as something that is both a facilitator and a driver of many other development ills, environmental ills. And then building on that, similar to what Natalie just said, is the incredible importance of, before programming, so now if we're talking about development programming, for instance, really looking at the potential ways that corruption might be derailing what you're trying to achieve. And also understanding what the dynamics of that corruption are in any particular setting and with reference to any particular problem. We encourage people to look at what is the impact of corruption on the thing that you're trying to achieve, as opposed to, sometimes it's a little too much to look at what is corruption everywhere affecting everything in this country where we're working. So try to narrow down your issues, the impact that you're looking at. Try to, again, break apart that concept. Corruption is not just one thing, it's a lot of different things. And one of the things that we found really important, and it takes time, is that the conversations need to start just to build a shared understanding of what we're all talking about and what different pieces, whether you're talking within an agency or across agencies, what different pieces people have. And that takes a long time really to build that up. So to try to create a foundation for that, even a home base of information that people can access on different aspects of it. I'm sure other people have similar things to say, but that's what I would start with.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. Peter, Canada's place in the world of the global illicit financial flow system and any topics beyond that you have recommendations on?
Yeah, I'm hardly qualified to lecture our officials. We've got great employees at Global Affairs, ambassadors and so forth, but I'll just point out a couple of things. One that we haven't talked about, and that is Canada's heavy involvement in the extractive industries internationally. We are definitely in many hotspots of the world. I spent a little bit of time trying to find a couple of our diplomats who were kidnapped near a gold mine many years ago in Africa. And I mean, this is a reality for Canadians in the gas and oil sectors and mining generally. So Canada does play a role overseas, and we have to be aware of that. I would just, again, reiterate that transparency, I really think, is key to a lot of this, and transparency in government. And the other that I would point out is both of our federal political parties, as I understand it, included the International Anti-Corruption Court in their last federal election platforms. So they've both already committed to at least looking at the issue of an anti-corruption court. And I know there's arguments both ways, but it certainly is something that Canada can get behind and help build, help create in a meaningful manner. So thank you.
Great. And definitely we didn't get a chance to get to that very point that it was endorsed by both the Liberals and Conservatives. And there's a number of Canadian heavyweights. So I think we're going to have that conversation another time because it's definitely in the air. But Cheyanne, I'm going to give you the last word of all your conversation with international affairs and development officials. What's your recommendation at the end of all this?
Okay, great. A couple of things. So a number of us have already said that regardless if you're working on gender or poverty or COVID-19 response, ask the question, how might corruption impede your ability to achieve this success? But once you ask that, then of course you have to say, well, what are we going to do about it? And there's a classic array of what I consider technical, tactical responses, things like diminishing discretion through the use of technology or making more information transparent to enable accountability. In the places that I work, these are rarely, if ever, going to be sufficient. And we need to be thinking in a more sophisticated manner around the role of power, politics, and social dynamics. And so when we're standing up our anti-corruption response and when our very talented colleagues at Global Affairs Canada and their implementing partners are thinking, well, what should we do to respond? We must not sit only in this place of a technical response. We must look at how are the power dynamics interfacing with what we're going to do, because they will fight back. That's why corruption is a powerful system. They will not take it lightly. They will not say, good one, Canada, you're right, I better stop this. No, they're going to fight back, and we need to have adaptable, responsive programming that is able to take in that data, understand how the system is changing or fighting back, and respond accordingly. So recommendation one, expand to understand the political and the power dynamics of what you're going to try and respond to, and factor that into your programming. Number two, that expansion also needs to include the social dynamics, and specifically the role of social norms that drive corrupt patterns of behavior. Social norms are those unwritten rules, and they typically explain the difference between what the official rules, codes of conduct, of practices are, and what the actual behavior is. And if we don't go after those unwritten rules in order to shift, reframe, or change them, what the research shows is that they will be a brake on sustainable behavior change. So we have to go after them. And my final one, Canadian Centre for Peace, Order, and Good Government. Endemic corruption locks society into negative peace. That means gross inequality. It means no rule of law. It means weak institutions. So this center, that we are very keen to see stood up, the Canadian Centre for Peace, Order, and Good Government, I would argue, I would hope, could take, and I'm using this term a little bit broadly, an intersectional approach to all of these fields and locate anti-corruption right at the center, because without anti-corruption, we can't have peace, order, and good government. So I think that is such an opportunity for Canada to lead in a far more sophisticated manner in this field. And that would be my biggest hope for what Global Affairs can do in the next couple of years. Thanks, James.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cheyanne. Thank you to the whole panel for incredible insights from all perspectives. I think we hit the point of Canada has to think about anti-corruption in our foreign policy. And then B, we went to the myriad of ways to think about it. And it's a conversation to keep going on. We only briefly heard about even Magnitsky Law and sanctions, which we didn't get into. We briefly touched on International Anti-Corruption Court. We barely even got a chance to talk about where does the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act and deferred prosecution agreements fit into this. But I think this panel made a very strong point of Global Affairs Canada, the private sector, defense sector, Justice Canada, public safety, and a number of our branches of government and even private sector actors and our partners in international development organizations need to think through this as a cross-cutting issue. So with that, Susan, I will pass it over to you as you've been listening along to sum up things, and then I will also blatantly use that time to make pleas to our audience, especially those in Canada. Please donate to TI Canada. If you've enjoyed this webinar and the webinars throughout the year, we are small, but as always with Canada, mighty, punching above our weight, although I think we're now saying humble but ambitious is the new foreign policy. And so we need your support. You can become a donor, you can become a member or an organizational supporter. I will plug those links into the chat box while Susan is speaking. Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, James. First of all, I want to thank our speakers, Natalie, Cheyanne, Peter, and Liz, for really fascinating insights today. It's a complicated topic, but I think I won't sum up because I couldn't do it, but I think what stays with me is this whole notion of widening the lens and, being more aware of the ecosystem. We're doing, international assistance and foreign policy, and also taking the time to sort of take people up to speed so that people start understanding what the issues are. And also, I think as Canada, we have to take a good look at ourselves. I mean, Liz mentioned the fact that we pursue interests that are sometimes at odds. I mean, development assistance that takes into consideration anti-corruption can be at odds with a trade promotion. And we got to look at that. How are we going to do these two things? And it takes time, it takes awareness. And I hope that today we started sort of, it's a bit of a spark towards that awareness. And I'm hopeful that the Summit for Democracy actually will put this whole notion of integration right front and center, and that it becomes a bit of a buzzword so that, the concept widens and that we really take it on. But I want to thank you all and to thank ACLP for putting this webinar together today, and James also for the idea around this webinar. I think it's been a really useful hour and a half, and thanks again to everybody. And please join TI Canada if you haven't done so yet. We need a lot of supporters. And Peter, good luck on your launch later this week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.